program here. We ready?
Allison, yes, please.
So good morning, Madam Chair and Commissioner. So the next item, 9A, is an informational briefing on the storage of spent nuclear fuel within the coastal zone, with a specific focus on the Coastal Commission's 2015 approval of a coastal development permit to construct a new spent fuel storage facility at the San Onofre Nuclear Generating Station, which is commonly referred to as SONGS. Spent fuel is high-level radioactive waste and therefore extremely hazardous to all forms of life and the environment. There is, therefore, a lot of anxiety and concern about storing this material anywhere, especially so close to the beach, and reasonably so. Since the Commission's 2015 approval of the permit for the new SONG storage facility, we continue to receive angry letters and requests that the Commission revoke the permit. Also, the Commission was sued over this permit decision. The plaintiffs claimed in part that the Commission did not adequately consider off-site storage alternatives. That case was recently settled between the plaintiffs and SONGS operators. So staff decided to schedule this informational briefing after, well, shall I say, a rather boisterous public comment session the last time that the Commission met here in San Diego. Today, we're going to provide an oral presentation briefly addressing the Commission's role in activities at nuclear power plants, an overview of past Commission actions on spent fuel storage proposals, and a review of the 2015 permit to store spent fuel at SONGS. We provided you online with the findings in support of the Commission's decision in 2015 to approve the new spent fuel storage facility at SONGS. And I believe today we handed out a hard copy of the settlement agreement. We're really pleased today to have a representative here from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, Mike Layton, to provide information on the federal government's efforts to develop a permanent spent fuel repository and potential options for off-site interim storage. It is the NRC's role to oversee the storage, disposal, and security of spent fuel. And Mr. Layton has agreed to stay for the full hearing to be able to answer any Commissioner questions. So we're going to start with Louise Warren, the Commission's Deputy Chief Counsel. Louise will address the Commission's legal constraints over reviewing radiological safety and the Commission's legal standards for permit revocations. And then following Louise will be Joseph Street, a senior environmental scientist with the Commission, and Joe served as the staff's lead analyst on the SONG spent fuel storage facility approved in 2015.
Thank you, Allison. So we expect that a number of people here today will express concerns over the safety of storing spent nuclear fuel at SONGS. Staff is very sympathetic to these concerns, but the bottom line is that the Coastal Commission does not have the authority to regulate radiological safety. Under federal law, states are preempted from imposing on operators of nuclear facilities any regulatory requirements concerning radiation hazards or nuclear safety. This comes from a 1983 opinion, PG&E versus the State Energy Resources Conservation and Development Commission. They're now known as the Energy Commission. The U.S. Supreme Court, thank you, found that the Atomic Energy Act completely preempts state regulation of the radiological safety aspects of the construction and operation of nuclear facilities. This includes disposal of nuclear waste. Is that not? Next slide. Thank you. Next slide, please. So in the decades since that decision, courts have continued to apply this broad rule of preemption in a variety of circumstances, including state efforts to regulate the storage of spent nuclear fuel. These cases also acknowledge that states do have a role to play and some authority over nuclear power plants. But this authority must be exercised in a manner that does not interfere with federal regulation of such sites, including anything having to do with radiological safety. Thus, the Coastal Act still applies, but it can only be applied in a manner that does not interfere with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission's oversight of spent nuclear fuel and radiological safety issues. Given these legal constraints, Commission staff's recommendations to the Commission regarding development activities at our coastal nuclear power plants, including spent fuel storage facilities, were necessarily limited to the aspects of the project that do not relate to radiological safety. In the instance of the most recent proposal to add nuclear spent fuel storage at Songs, the Commission was required to consider the project's consistency with the Coastal Act without regard for the type of material that was being stored and without regard to whether the storage method would be safe from a radiological perspective. We understand that a number of people here today may be asking the Commission to overturn its prior decision. That is not something that the Commission can do today. As Allison said, this is just an informational briefing. But moreover, that decision could only have been overturned if there had been a request for reconsideration, which can only be made by the project applicant and must be done within 30 days of the decision. That didn't happen. That decision was challenged legally, and as Allison said, that case was just settled. The other way for that decision to be overturned is for it to be revoked. And if I can move 2 slides forward, I believe. Yes. Under the Commission's regulations, the grounds for revocation are extremely narrow. The person requesting revocation has the burden of demonstrating 2 things. First, that there was an intentional omission or misrepresentation of information, and second, that without that omission or misrepresentation, the Commission would have added new conditions, modified one of its conditions, or denied the permit outright. The Commission staff has seen several revocation requests in the past few months for this permit. None of those requests have provided any evidence that either of those standards have been met. So with that, I'll turn it over to Joe. I'm available for questions.
Okay, good morning, Commissioners. My goal now is to provide you with an overview of spent nuclear fuel storage in California.
What is your name, your full name? Excuse me, I'm not running this meeting. I'm a citizen, I have to go with the same.
Sure. My name is Joseph Street. I'm a member of the Coastal Commission staff. So as I was saying, I'm going to try to provide you with an overview of spent fuel storage in California, followed by a review of the 2015 Coastal Development Permit that approved the new storage facility at Songs. First off, just a few basics. When we're talking about spent fuel, we're talking about used fuel that has been removed from a nuclear reactor when it's no longer useful for power production. The reactors at Songs used fuel consisting of uranium dioxide pellets that were packaged into these metal fuel rods. They're each about 12 feet long, which were in turn packaged into fuel assemblies. And those would be made up of several hundred rods, which would then be loaded into the reactors. As it is used, the nuclear fuel becomes increasingly radioactive, and after removal from a reactor is considered high-level radioactive waste, and it needs to be stored securely for tens of thousands of years. At Songs, as at other commercial reactors, spent fuel was initially stored and cooled in large spent fuel pools located in buildings adjacent to the generators. The water in the pools provides protection from radiation, and it's also the means of dissipating the heat that's still being produced by these fuel assemblies. Freshly removed fuel must remain. Excuse me. The fresh fuel has to remain in these pools for a number of years until its initially high levels of radioactivity and heat have declined somewhat. At this point, the fuel can be relocated to another storage facility, if there is one available. On-site storage continues to be necessary because the United States has not yet established a permanent spent fuel repository. The 1982 Nuclear Waste Policy Act, the Department of Energy is responsible for the permanent storage of commercial spent fuel. The DOE was required to begin accepting fuel for disposal beginning in 1998, and obviously this has not occurred yet. The repository at Yucca Mountain, Nevada is partially constructed, but it has not yet been completed. In the meantime, spent fuel is continuing to be stored at individual power plant sites around the country. Much of the fuel is still in the spent fuel pools, but many sites have also constructed dry storage facilities, or independent spent fuel storage systems, often referred to by the tongue twister of ISFSI. I'm not going to use that term too often. In dry storage, spent fuel rods, which have cooled sufficiently, are transferred to metal containers and stored in a secure facility. There are a variety of different designs in use for dry storage, including containers of different materials and thicknesses. Most U.S. facilities have used weld-sealed canisters that are then placed within secondary casks or overpacks of concrete or metal. Next slide, please. There are 4 existing dry storage facilities in California. 3 of these, the Humboldt Bay Power Plant, Diablo Canyon, and San Onofre, are located in the coastal zone and were the subjects of previous coastal development permits approved by the Commission. Next slide, please. The first dry storage facility approved by the Commission was at Songs itself in the year 2000 as part of the permit for the decommissioning of Unit 1. In November of that year, the Commission approved a second permit that allowed for the construction of a larger facility that could store some spent fuel from Units 2 and 3 as well. The existing facility is located in the North Industrial Area, which is the former site of Unit 1. As constructed, the existing Songs facility stores 51 canisters, with space for about 42 more. Canisters are stored in a horizontal orientation in an above-ground concrete structure. There is also a dry storage facility at Diablo Canyon, located on the hillside above the plant. The Commission approved this facility on appeal in 2004. This is an above-ground vertical storage facility, and this one has the capacity to eventually hold 140 of these canisters. In 2005, the Commission also approved a dry storage facility at the Humboldt Bay Nuclear Power Plant, which is closed. This is a relatively small facility, and it uses a below-ground system, and it stores 6 canisters. So each of these storage sites had its own set of complications and concerns that the Commission had to grapple with, not the least being the potential for exposure to natural hazards, as well as the fact that there was no permanent storage facility to secure the fuel for the long term. In each case, the Commission conditionally approved the dry storage facilities to ensure conformance with Coastal Act policies, but as Louise has talked about, these decisions specifically excluded consideration of radiological safety. Okay, so at this point, I'd like to shift gears and talk a bit about the Commission's 2015 approval of a second dry storage facility at Songs. I should first note that since 2012, Songs has not been producing any electricity, and the operators are proposing the full decommissioning of the site. That project is currently undergoing CEQA review with the State Lands Commission as the lead agency, and it will require a coastal development permit from the Commission. The new dry storage facility, which is essentially complete, is located within the North Industrial Area immediately seaward of the existing facility. The new facility is a partially below-grade structure with capacity to store 75 additional fuel canisters. With the existing facility, this will allow for the storage of all the remaining spent fuel. This slide shows a cross-section of the new facility. Back one, please. Showing its relationship to the existing grade of the site, the existing storage structures, and also to the shoreline. Essentially, it's a fill and concrete berm surrounding individual storage modules that would each contain a canister of spent fuel. Next. This slide shows a cutaway of the system with its major components. Edison proposed to operate the storage facility until 2049, when it was assumed that a federal repository or other storage facility would be available to take the fuel. Following the transfer of the fuel, Edison plans to decommission and remove the facility by 2051. So, as with the previous dry storage projects, the Commission reviewed the new facility for its consistency with Coastal Act policies, excluding radiological safety, and our particular focus was on project alternatives and natural hazards. The Commission, in October of 2015, the Commission found that at the time there were no feasible off-site alternatives. Then, as now, there was no permanent repository or other interim storage facility. And existing waste facilities at other nuclear plants are not currently licensed to accept outside fuel, even if they were willing to do so. There were several feasible on-site locations for the storage facility, but overall, the proposed location was superior in terms of site logistics, security, and most importantly for the Commission, the stability of the substrate. However, the Commission also noted that additional on-site locations would become available once Units 2 and 3 are decommissioned and the major structures removed. Some of these future potential sites have the advantage of being further inland or at higher elevation than the current site. Within Edison's proposed 35-year time frame, the siting and design of the dry storage facility would be sufficient to minimize risks to the facility from geologic hazards, including ground shaking during earthquakes, slope stability, flooding, and coastal erosion, without requiring additional shoreline protection. However, due to the current lack of an alternative storage site, it's unclear whether Edison will be able to meet its timeline for transferring the spent fuel and removing the facility by 2051. So if there is no alternative, and one doesn't begin to be developed in the relatively near future, we could be facing a situation where the dry storage is required beyond 2051 and potentially well beyond 2051. Over time, the storage site would be eventually exposed to coastal hazards beyond its design capacity, or it would require protection by retaining or expanding the existing shoreline armoring. In order to address these uncertainties and assure that the dry storage facility is not affected by erosion and flooding hazards, and thus avoids impacts to coastal resources over the actual life of the project, the Commission adopted Special Condition 2. This condition limits authorization of the development to 20 years and requires Edison to return for a permit amendment at the end of that period. And this permit amendment would be to retain, remove, or relocate the facility based on a reanalysis of the existing alternatives at the time, and also including a reanalysis of the hazards based on the current situation and the new information that will undoubtedly emerge over the next 20 years about hazards. If Edison wishes to retain the facility beyond 2035, it may need to formulate a plan for managed retreat that would avoid these hazards and the need for shoreline protection for the remaining life of the project, whatever that may be. Avoiding future hazards may ultimately depend on Edison being able to move the fuel to another storage site, either at Songs or an outside facility. To do this, the fuel canisters must remain in a physical condition that will allow this transfer to happen. The NRC has certified the integrity of the storage system, including the canisters, for 20 years, and requires Edison to develop an aging management plan for the continued storage of the fuel prior to any renewal of the dry storage license. In order to address this issue, the Commission also adopted Special Condition 7, which requires Edison to develop an inspection and maintenance program at an earlier date, by 2022. The recent settlement agreement resolving the citizens' oversight lawsuit moves this deadline up to 2020. So at this point, I'd like to introduce Mike Layton, who is the director of the NRC's Division of Spent Fuel Management. Once the Commission decided to hold this briefing, staff reached out to the NRC to see if a representative could attend to address the federal government's current efforts to secure off-site storage for spent fuel. So we're pleased to introduce Mr. Layton.
Thank you, Dr. Street. I'm Michael Layton. I'm the Director for Spent Fuel Management at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission at their headquarters. And I really appreciate the opportunity, Madam Chair and Commissioners, for the invitation to come and talk with you and give you at least a small view of what the Nuclear Regulatory Commission's roles and responsibilities are for spent fuel management. If you're not familiar with the NRC, and I do have some slides, but I can certainly wax eloquently in old school and just talk. But Nuclear Regulatory Commission is a rather small agency in comparison to other federal agencies. Roughly, we have about 3,200 employees. We have 5 political appointees. Those are the commission and the chair, and commissioners and the chairman. The bulk of the agency is comprised of technical experts of various disciplines and experiences. And we do have a small cadre of folks who provide the corporate support for our organization. We have a headquarters office outside of Washington, D.C., and 4 regional offices. So with that, rather than belabor an awful lot on our roles and responsibilities, I have brought some brochures that talk about what we do in spent fuel storage and transportation. Those are in the entryway if you're interested, or if you would like copies, I can send those to the staff for your perusal. We have 3 main functions at NRC for spent fuel management. We do the licensing, certification, and oversight for all spent fuel management, both dry cask storage and in spent fuel pool storage. And that encompasses, the NRC encompasses all civilian radioactive material management. And the mission of the agency is to assure that any use of that civilian radioactive material, whether it's for medical, industrial, or even waste materials or power generation, is done in a radiologically safe manner, a secure manner, and also environmentally sound. So as our responsibilities are primarily under licensing, certification, and inspection, those are the bulk of what we do on our technical reviews, as your staff has described on the licensing arrangements that we've done for spent fuel. We're also very heavily involved in coordination and guidance development with the international community and other state organizations, in particular the Department of Transportation, Department of Energy, Environmental Protection Agency, and also Native American tribes. And probably the third, and in my opinion, some of the more important aspect of our role is public outreach on activities that we do. We are happy to come and talk with whoever wishes to hear us describe what we do for radioactive waste management. And again, we do appreciate the opportunity to come and talk with you. I do have one slide that I think, if we're able to pull it up, would illustrate some of the breadth and extent that we have on spent fuel management. We've been doing this for roughly over 30 years now. Spent fuel storage facilities, these independent spent fuel storage installations, are located in about 34 states, including California. They are all composed of various designs. Some of the designs are horizontal, like you've seen in the previous slide. Some are vertical. Many of them are welded. Some are bolted tops. Some are very thick wall canisters. Some are other thinner canisters with using stainless steel. I'll just cycle ahead quickly here. This is the illustration I was referring to of where the locations for the independent spent fuel storage facilities are. And as you can see, there's a wide distribution of them. There are only a few facilities yet to request licenses for spent fuel management. Those are kind of the, by color vision, brownish or orangish pentagons. And then the 2 facilities that you have interest in Texas and New Mexico, I'll provide some information on those a little later. For the inspection program, we do routine inspections of spent fuel storage facilities. Integrated inspection planning is one in which we have multiple disciplines from both our headquarters office and our regional office. A good example of this that's happening right now is inspectors from my office and also our Region 4 office are at the site doing a procedural review to support the dry run or the dress rehearsal for the movement of spent fuel from the pool into the canisters. And you've gotten a very good background on where things are with songs right now. The oversight of the construction, we have pretty much completed that, and as I said, we're working on the reviews for the fuel movements. The two types of canisters you've seen pictures of. And of course, the PSDAR is, and of course, you know, federal government, we do acronyms. It's the Post-Shutdown Decommissioning Notification Report. This is a report that the licensee provides to NRC and is a publicly available document. And it states that their plan is to remove all spent fuel into dry storage within 2019. What I'd like to do is spend a little bit more time giving you information on where we are with two actions before us. One is the consolidated interim storage applications. There's two facilities. One is the Holtec Eddie Lea facility in New Mexico, and also waste control specialists across the border in Texas. We received the application for Holtec, and we're currently in a process which we call the acceptance review. That's where we look at the application and assure that there's enough detail in it for us to docket the application for detailed technical review. We're in the process of that acceptance review. We have provided some requests for supplemental information to the applicant. They've been providing us responses to those requests. And for schedule, if by the end of this year we receive all of the responses from the applicant, we will be in a position to make a docketing decision in early 2018. For waste control specialists, much the same process. We did accept the application in April of 2016, or I'm sorry, in January of 2017. Waste control specialists asked us to suspend the review in April of 2017 as they had business concerns that had no impact on what was provided in the application. So we did what we call a cold shutdown of the review. You may have heard in press reports that Waste Control Specialist has been indicating that they may be coming back and asking NRC to restart the application review. That's the only information that we have is from the press. They have not contacted us directly. But we're in a position where we could start that review in a very short period of time and pick it up from where we left off. The DOE Consolidated Interim Storage TSAR, which is the Topical Safety Analysis Report, is something that the Department of Energy will draft and provide to us for our review on the transportation and storage if movement of the fuel from reactor facilities, SFICs, to a centralized interim storage facility is to take place. And obviously, we're going to engage stakeholders within our role, and principally that's whenever we have public meetings on the safety review, which don't involve security aspects or proprietary information. Those are all open to the public. And also, we did start the environmental scoping reviews for waste control specialists. We will restart those activities if and when we start the safety review again. And we will have scoping meetings for the Holtec application once the decision is made if it's acceptable for docketing. Something that you're probably interested in is timelines. How long is this going to take? Well, this isn't the first time that we've reviewed an application like this. We have reviewed an application for private fuel storage back in the 90s, and we have a very regimented timeline that we did for our planning for this, based on the experience that we had from private fuel storage. For the safety review, this is the radiological safety. We're looking at approximately 2 years for the review from the time that we docket the application. For the environmental review, including the scoping, and this will run in parallel with the safety review, it will take 2 years plus an additional year to complete the environmental review and the environmental impact statement. Now, this is without any contentions filed by interveners for a hearing. Now, for private fuel storage, there were contentions filed, and that process with the hearing proceedings took over 7 years to complete, and the license was issued for that. The facility was never put into operation or built. The next thing that we have in front of us is the permanent repository. And this slide shows the timeline of when things were submitted by DOE, when NRC docketed the license application, and also outlines when things were suspended. And right now, the proceedings, which is the hearing for the construction application, has not started. And that is contingent on funding in which Congress has to provide to NRC and the Department of Energy to continue with the proceedings. These are funds that are provided in the Nuclear Waste Fund. We cannot use, NRC cannot use any other appropriated funds to begin hearings for the permanent repository for high-level waste. We can only utilize high-level waste funds which are appropriated by Congress. So where we are right now is that the NRC has done pretty much as taken things as far as we can as far as planning goes. We've looked at, because there are indications, particularly on the House side of Congress, where funding may become available, both for us and the Department of Energy. So we have looked at what it would take to technically stand up a support organization to be able to proceed with the hearings, not only for NRC staff, which is a party to the hearings, but also for the Atomic Safety Licensing Review Board, which is the adjudicatory body which will oversee those hearings. So we've done some estimates of what it would take technical staff-wise, and we feel that we're in a very good position that if the funding comes through in 2018, that we would be positioned to begin preparations for the hearings to proceed. Our planning assumptions for this is that the proceedings would take anywhere from 3 to 4 years because there are many contentions. It would be up to the Atomic Safety Licensing Board to decide whether they would run multiple boards in parallel or take contentions in serial, one at a time. Right now, the planning assumption is that there would be multiple boards working in parallel. Now, in parallel to this activity, there will be a rulemaking coming forward for the Geologic Repository Operations Area. This is a security rulemaking. And NRC had started a draft rule and draft regulatory basis for this back in the early 2000s and suspended that when the application review and the proceedings were suspended. We will restart that rulemaking, and that'll continue roughly over the same period of time that the proceedings would be, so that that rulemaking, and after 3 or 4 years, the Atomic Safety Licensing Board would be in a position to render a decision on whether to issue a construction permit or not. So that's only the authorization. To build the facility, for those of you who are interested in going back into the DOE application and looking at the timelines laid out, what I would suggest is look at the current timelines that are in DOE's application and count in the hiatus that has occurred, approximately 10 years. And that will give you an idea of about when construction would take place and when DOE would be able to commence activities to receive material. By rough estimate, that would be sometime where they would be able to get their construction authorization probably in about 2022, roughly. And then the earliest that they would be able to receive material would be about 2027. And those are estimates just based on certain planning assumptions. And with that, I'll be happy to answer any of your questions whenever the time comes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Does that complete the staff report? Okay, so do you think we should go ahead with Southern California Edison for a few minutes? Yeah, we'll just keep going along until, okay. So Tom Palmisano from Southern California Edison. I also have Dan Stetson here, secretary. Do you both want to speak?
Yeah, I believe Mr. Stetson has a speaker's card in as well.
Yes.
So
Good, I wanted to be
very
able
good.
to do it together. Okay.
And I have a slide deck I've prepared, if that can be queued up, please. So thank you very much. My name is Tom Palmisano. I'm the Vice President of Decommissioning and the Chief Nuclear Officer for Southern California Edison, the San Onofre Nuclear Generating Plant. I'm also here on behalf of all the owners. We are actually also owned by San Diego Gas and Electric and the cities of Riverside and Anaheim. So I represent all the owners. And I'll be brief. I want to make sure we get a good public comment period. It's important. What I want to talk about has been a good recap by the staff and by Mr. Layton of the situation with the permit, the on-site storage plans, and then moving on to plans for potentially Yucca Mountain or interim storage. So what I want to focus on is our efforts and our continuing efforts to be prepared and find a way to move fuel off-site to a more suitable location. None of us want spent fuel stored at songs any longer than it needs to be. And the key here is finding a location, getting a location licensed and built. That involves a lot of activity, including public and local acceptance of that type of facility. So that's what my remarks are going to focus on. Next slide, please. Okay, first of all, we support all safe and reasonable solutions for moving fuel on site. We have stated this ever since we closed the plant in 2013 and started talking in 2014 about the decommissioning plan. All of our stakeholders, I think, are in agreement. We don't want the fuel stored there any longer than is necessary. There's a couple off-site possibilities, and they've been briefly summarized. Let me just recap. The Department of Energy is ultimately responsible for building a deep geological repository and removing the fuel from the site. That is their responsibility under the 1982 Nuclear Waste Policy Act. The NRC has been described as the safety regulator, but the responsibility to build and move the fuel to a facility is Department of Energy. Yucca Mountain has been underway. Funding was reduced in 2011, and as you saw with the slide on the licensing activities were stopped in 2016. There are some hopeful signs in Congress, particularly in the House, about potential restart of funding, but that's a long path. So it's not going to be acceptable to us just to wait for Yucca Mountain. So we are very interested also in supporting the combined interim storage opportunities by Holtec Eddie Lee, or potentially by waste control specialists. And I would note there's some representatives from Holtec Eddie Lee here today. They can answer their questions. So we need a facility licensed and built that's suitable and that's acceptable, and we need transportation. DOE is responsible for transportation. The good news is they've developed a design for a prototype rail car, which they're now going to build and test, which will transport a cask with the spent fuel canister inside. They've gone out with a request for information in 2016 to get input to siting a local facility. The systems we are using on site and intending to use are Riva and Holtec, Riva the horizontal one, Holtec the vertical one, are approved from a safety standpoint by the NRC for storage and transportation, and they both have licensed transportation casks that have been approved. And we have also committed, as part of the settlement that's alluded to develop a conceptual transportation plan about how a spent fuel cask with a canister inside would be moved to some location nominally in the southwest. And I would say on-site dry storage is really the first step in this country to preparing for off-site shipment, to canister the fuel, prepare it for shipment. Next slide, please. It is important to understand where Song's fuel stands. This is very specific. We currently have 50 canisters loaded with fuel. We will load another 73 for a total of 123. By 2020, 102 of those canisters will be eligible to ship. There's decay times after they were taken out of the reactor. 102 canisters of fuel will be ready to ship as early as the end of 2020. The remaining 21 will mature and be ready to ship by 2030. So when I look at the timeline of getting a facility available, we will be ready to ship as a facility becomes available, and that's important. Next slide, please. There's a lot of work we are doing, and this is where it's important that we need help with this with all the stakeholders. There's federal level support needed. There's funding needed for DOE for licensing. There's funding needed to build a facility. There's funding needed to potentially support a combined interim storage facility done by a private party, and we all need to be asking for federal action on that. We have enlisted a lot of state-level support to make that clear, from the state of California to the government, a lot of local and community support, and we appreciate that, and we continue with that. The settlement agreement, I'm not going to go in depth, but I think it really brings clarity and formality to our commitments to work to move the fuel off-site and helps align us with some of our stakeholders to really work towards that end. Next slide, please. The bottom line is summarized. We have and will continue to store spent fuel safely. We have stored spent fuel safely in wet storage or dry storage ever since Unit 1 opened in the late 60s. We are committed to, and it's our responsibility, we will continue to do that until it's off-site. And secondly, we are working diligently to support any safe and reasonable effort to move it off-site. With that, I would be happy to answer any questions from the Commission.
Thank you. We'll just proceed with testimony,
Thank you.
and since you'll be here, we'll have questions for later. Mr. Stetson, please.
Good morning. My name is Dan Stetson, and for the last 23 years, it was my honor to work at a place called the Ocean Institute in Dana Point, California. And during my time there, we were recipients of a number of funds through the Whale Tail program. So I want to thank you again for your support with those programs. During my tenure as president of the Ocean Institute, I was approached by Southern California Edison to serve as a volunteer on their newly formed community engagement panel. Despite vociferous protestations from my wife, I agreed. I agreed to serve, and today I reflect on what I've learned over my past 3 years as secretary of this panel. The CEP meets quarterly and has 17 volunteers from local communities ranging from elected officials in environmental NGOs to business and labor leaders. The First Amendment, freedom of speech, is certainly alive and well at our meetings as people of good faith and good conscience have debated vigorously on what's happening regarding the decommissioning process. However, there is one thing that we all agree upon, and that is the importance of moving the spent fuel out of San Onofre as quickly as possible. That's why the CEP has hosted several public meetings and quite a number of workshops regarding this issue and bringing thought leaders in from all over the country. This has included folks from the President's Blue Ribbon Commission on America's Nuclear Future, the Bipartisan Policy Center, the Department of Energy, the NRC, and many, many others. During one of our meetings, former NRC Chair Allison McFarland spoke about the importance of working together and trying to break down barriers. Unless you work together, she said, your voice will never be heard in Washington, D.C. Before the end of the year, the spent fuel rods will start to be moved out of the cooling pools and into dry storage. This is a most important step towards increasing safety, and it's also a necessary precursor for moving the rods out of here to another site. We are cautiously optimistic that we have movement on consolidated interim storage and the potential for a process to move forward in Mexico and maybe even Texas, as well as the potential for restarting the process for a final geological repository. Getting the fuel off-site safely and responsibly is the number one priority for all of us in the communities surrounding San Onofre. Even if a site was prepared tomorrow, it would take 10 years to ship all of the spent fuel out of San Onofre. So time is of the essence, and we must start moving right away. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, well, that were the applicants, so we're going to move on to the elected officials who will be in the next in line. Maybe we can get through those as well. Okay, Mary Ann Pintar representing Congressman Scott Peters. 3 minutes apiece. State your name too, please.
Good afternoon. Thank you to the Commission for holding a hearing here in our region. My name is Marianne Pintar. I am Congressman Scott Peters' District Chief of Staff here in San Diego. He asked me to speak on his behalf today. He is in Washington, D.C., voting in the House, so he could not be here himself. As many of you know, or maybe you don't know, Congressman Peters has taken an active role to address the problem of what to do with the spent nuclear fuel that is a product of shutting down the San Onofre nuclear generating station. He's toured the facility to see firsthand the current state of operations and to hear from operators and staff on the ground, and is working to develop the best path forward. As a member of the U.S. House of Representatives Energy and Commerce Committee, the committee with jurisdiction to regulate spent nuclear fuel, Congressman Peters is working to advance legislation that will, as soon as possible, meet our goal of moving this waste away from population centers and away from the ocean. Any option to safely move spent nuclear fuel away from the SONGS campus to a temporary or permanent location will require an act of Congress. Earlier this year, Congressman John Shimkus, who chairs the House Energy and Commerce Committee, introduced a bill that would move towards finishing permanent storage at Yucca Mountain. However, Shimkus's bill did not allow for interim storage to be created until Yucca is finished. Unfortunately, this would have meant that the politics that have prevented Yucca Mountain's completion for decades would hurt our efforts to move the spent nuclear fuel at SONGS to an interim location. After long discussions at the committee's energy subcommittee and then at the full committee, Congressman Peters and his colleagues came to an agreement that allows the Department of Energy for the first time to certify interim storage while at the same time pursuing a path toward permanent storage at Yucca Mountain. With this compromise language included, the bill passed out of committee with nearly unanimous bipartisan support. We will continue to fight for its passage in the full House of Representatives, then in the Senate, and urge its approval by the President. We all recognize the importance of providing both interim storage away from environmentally sensitive settings and population centers, and then ultimately into safe, permanent storage. There's no reason to force a false choice between the two. Congressman Peters is committed to providing the advocacy we need in Washington to make it happen, and he appreciates all of those who have worked to get to this point. We thank the Coastal Commission again for holding this meeting here in our region and for allowing me to speak here on Congressman Peters' behalf today. Thank you.
Thank you. Deanna Spen, on behalf of Senator Tony Atkins. I know I said
Thank you very much. You should have a copy of the letter from the senator. Dear Chair Bochco, Executive Director Ainsworth, and members of the Coastal Commission, I write out of a long-standing concern about the status of the 3.55 million pounds of nuclear waste currently stored at the San Onofre Nuclear Generating Station. Many voices have expressed concern over the years about the lack of a safe and secure permanent federal repository for nuclear waste. I look forward to learning the Federal Nuclear Regulatory Commission's plans for developing a permanent federal spent fuel repository and the options for off-site interim storage. Continuing to store the spent fuel within yards of the Pacific Ocean near an identified earthquake fault with 8 million people living within the 50-mile safety zone should a major leak occur is unacceptable. The Coastal Commission and the State Lands Commission each have a role in the regulatory oversight for SONGS. The Coastal Commission has issued a coastal development permit for an on-site spent fuel storage facility. The State Lands Commission is set to release a draft environmental impact report in early to mid-2018, analyzing a proposal to decontaminate or dismantle the SONGS onshore facilities, including pipelines used for seawater cooling of the site, and to restore the site over the next 10 to 30 years. The California Energy Commission, California Public Utilities Commission, and California Department of Public Health each have roles relating to SONGS and the soon-to-be decommissioned Diablo Nuclear Power Plant. I urge the Coastal Commission to convene a joint public meeting to weigh the state's options in making the situation at San Onofre safer for the 8 million people who would be seriously affected by a nuclear accident at the site. And my name is Deanna Spain. I am the Policy Director for State Senator Tony Atkins. Thank you very much.
Jerry Kern, City Council, Oceanside City.
Good afternoon. I really appreciate you guys actually hearing this today. As stated before, I'm Jerry Kern. I'm council member, City of Oceanside, but I've also been a member of the community engagement panel since the inception. In fact, I'm really the only active San Diego County representative on the panel. And I'm here today is to really talk about moving the nuclear fuel safely and as quickly as possible, because one of the real tenets of our commission is safety. In fact, safety is the primary reason that we do what we do. I support the cast storage and use nuclear fuel. That is probably the safest way right now to store the fuel. But also, in my view, passive storage is a more viable option for the safety to contain and maintain than the cooling pools. It's a passive system. It's not active. It doesn't depend on electricity. It doesn't depend on circulating water. It's a passive system, so it is the safer system, in my opinion, than the current cooling pools. Also, one of the things about the canisters, and we alluded to it, about movement of the fuel when it's ready to go. Once they're in the canisters and they're ready to go, and literally an act of Congress to get them to move, then we can get them moved hopefully as quickly as possible. So having them in the canisters ready to go, once the federal government finally takes responsibility and moves off to get things done, we can be there. I would hopefully get public support is that we go first. You know, the idea that we alluded to the issues about being close to the ocean, the fault zone. So once the facilities are open, I would like to be first in line. So I'm sure everybody in this room would be like the same way. But we have to be ready to go to be first in line. So having it in the canisters and ready to go and being first in line is very important. The communities that surround San Onofre have been very vocal about this very same thing. So I've been going up and down and talking to different communities and different chambers of commerce and different city councils about this. And as alluded to before, we're all in this agreement. We want it to move as quickly as possible. So having it ready to go is very important to us. And so I appreciate the commission actually hearing about this one more time and explaining and giving us the opportunity to explain what's going on with San Onofre and actually that we can actually start moving forward. So thank you, Madam Chairman. Thank you, Steve. Good luck.
Good luck, Steve. Thank you. Pam Patterson, Mayor of San Juan Capistrano. And I don't have any other speaker slips for elected officials. Did I miss anybody? Okay, good. Thank you.
Thank you. I was actually surprised to hear the statements by the attorneys here that this is completely preempted by federal law. So I have a copy of the writ that was filed by Citizens Oversight. First of all, this case was filed in Superior Court, and there are a vast number of paragraphs in here that basically discuss safety issues. So this case was based on safety issues. So I'm assuming that the attorneys for the Coastal Commission would understand that if this was completely preempted by federal law, all you need to do is file a demur to get rid of the case. The case was filed November 3rd, 2015. The settlement agreement is dated August 28th, 2017. So the case went on for almost 2 years, yet it was completely preempted and wasn't filed in federal court. That sounds interesting to me. In 1963, so this is a letter from the United States Marine Corps, and it's to Joseph Street California Coastal Commission, where it talks about in 1963, Congress authorized the Secretary of the Navy to issue an easement on the site at San Onofre to Edison and SDG&E. So that was 54 years ago. So what have all these people been doing in the last 54 years with respect to the issue of the nuclear waste? We have, so now that, I mean, I like how they're saying, oh, now we need to start thinking about it. But we've had 54 years. Edison has had this easement for 54 years. It says here, this is, I'm just quoting from the writ filed by Citizens Oversight. Every 18 to 24 months, Edison shut down the plant to remove and replace about 1/3 of the fuel consisting of the oldest assemblies. So that must have started back in, I think the plant was opened in 68. So let's say starting in 1970, 1/3 of those spent uranium, those fuel assemblies, was being unloaded. And they're just piling up and nobody's even thinking about it. This is thousands of years worth of radiation. So Edison has a very long-term history of mismanagement. And the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, likewise, has a very long history of lack of regulating the utility companies. The Coastal Commission needs to reopen the public hearings and let the people be able to present the other side of the issue. We should be allowed to have our experts give their opinions and have the exact same amount of time that Edison was given presenting their side of the case. I have been serving on the community engagement panel now for over 2.5 years. I am very familiar with this situation and I attend all the meetings, and it's just a gag order by Edison with respect to the people and having their say. So you haven't been given all the information, and there's just no way, in my opinion, had you been given the information, you would have issued this permit. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay. All right, and we're going to break for lunch now, and we're